China's national security law for the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region officially came into effect on Tuesday night, an hour before the 23rd anniversary of Hong Kong's return to China. Well, the new legislation was immediately put into effect for protesters who violated the rule. Meanwhile, the United States and some Western countries raised objections which were soon opposed by China as an attempt by foreign powers to interfere in its internal affairs. How does the national security law affect social order in Hong Kong? What are the reactions from all sides, and what will be the impact? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very pleased to be joined by satellite by Mr. Whitman Hong, a Hong Kong deputy to the 13th National People's Congress, and joining us via Skype in London is Martin Jacques from the Department of Politics and International Relations at Cambridge University, and later John Ross, Senior Fellow at the Chung Yang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Let me start with you, Mr. Hong. The whole world is watching how the national security law for Hong Kong will be enforced. And on the first day, we see how the national security law already came into effect. Already some protesters have been arrested for offenses. What do you think happened on the first day in Hong Kong after the passing of the law?
Well, there are two sides of the story. On one side, there are many people celebrating the enactment of this law. Okay, I was actually on the street meeting quite a group of people who are organizing all these celebrations, signing of the support of the law. Of course, then what happened in the afternoon is there had been some protesters, and I'm actually glad to see there's a new flag by the police in the purple color, which I like, that shows that any breaching of the national security law will be arrested and potentially prosecuted. And quite rightly, there were quite a few arrested, although I'm not sure, whether they will be charged with the breach of national security law, because they're probably breaching some other laws, our criminal laws as well, because one policeman was hurt, and that suspect was subsequently arrested on a plane boarded for London. I actually walked past the area of this violence yesterday. It's not big. There were not a lot of protesters, but obviously some of the activities were very violent, and therefore I think the police.
Can you be more specific? How many protesters were involved, and in how large an area?
I don't have the figure. I forgot to read the news this morning, but from pure eyesight, I'm judging it's probably like hundreds. Okay,
so that's
like
largely a much smaller scale than what we saw at the end of last year. Can we say that?
Yes. Yes, definitely.
And what do you think of the police officers, law enforcement performances? Are they doing this with restraints? You said they had warned the protesters that this is a violation of the law.
Yes, I can see that. I mean, they're still new to these things, so that's why I said they had new purple color flag warning, because previously they had two other warning flags, which was red and yellow, I think, and this time it's blue. And then also, I think they're still learning, because the law was just enacted, a few hours ago, and they have no precedent cases, and the Department of Justice has not obviously issue instructions on how, on when, and by what measure to prosecute. But at least the police is, first of all, they are doing their job to keep law and order, to stop violence, to stop unlawful assembly, which was all part of their normal duty. Now, while they were carrying out that duty, they were also, observing there may be potential breach of the new law, and therefore there could be some arrest related to that.
And did you expect this happening on July the 1st after the adoption of the law? And do average Hong Kongers expect this on the streets?
Well, I can't say on behalf of the average Hong Konger, but yes, I was expecting that. The violence since June last year, have been carrying on for a long time. For a while, it was very violent. For a while, it was kind of deteriorated for various reasons, one of which was the pandemic. And in the past 2 months, we have seen again violence, resurface, especially during weekends, where people will be going into the malls and putting on demonstrations. But at the same time, there were certain acts of violence, such as hurting of certain individuals with different political opinions. Now, ever since the decision of actually drafting the law, which happened on the 22nd of May, I was there when they announced that decision. There has been obviously two responses. On one side, what we see is some of the opposition leaders and some very, figureheads coming out and say, "Oh, I was never against the unification of China. I was never for the independence of Hong Kong. I was never for the violence." And people are trying to distance themselves from potential unlawful activities. Okay, but at the same time, there are people who are saying, "Oh, we'll be over my dead body," they're threatening of more violent activities if the law is in fact enacted. So it was expected, but as I said, there are two very, very distinct, different responses from the protester side.
And Martin, about 370 people were arrested on Wednesday during protests against the new law. Of course, only at least 10 were caught because of the violation. What do you think of the level of the arrests and the boundary between peaceful protest and violation of this new law, which is about national security of China?
Well, it's a bit difficult to know at this distance. I mean, I did hear someone on the radio this morning in the UK saying more or less what you have just said, and saying that most of the people who were arrested were for relatively minor offences that were not in breach of the new legislation. But I don't know how many, but saying more or less a handful were arrested on those grounds. I mean, I was listening to Mr. Hong, I hope I've got your name right, with interest, because obviously the key that, the effectiveness of this legislation will depend a lot on its exemplary character. In other words, to what extent it persuades people not to violate the new law, and so the numbers that demonstrate are very important. And if the numbers are relatively small compared with what was happening for a good bit of last year, that would be encouraging, and it will enable the law to be to really take effect in quite rapidly in a meaningful way. The problem would be, it seems to me, that if very large numbers of people continually demonstrate and refuse, in effect, to recognise the new legislation, and then you've got a serious law and order challenge. And I hope that will not be the situation. I hope that what's going to happen is that, by and large, the new legislation does have an exemplary effect and will persuade people to, over time, to recognise the new situation and so on. I just add one point in relationship to this, and that is, of course, in my own country, and I think certainly in Western countries, the reaction has been very negative. I think that was entirely predictable for various reasons. But the fact of the matter is that no Western country would ever accept the kind of continued rioting on such a scale, week after week, month after month, that afflicted Hong Kong last year. I mean, and there was no national security legislation to deal with it. So, I mean, either that people are ignorant or they're feigning surprise. I mean, at the end of the day, what did they expect if that happens? And furthermore, I mean, one cannot but observe that essentially a lot of the Western media coverage was designed to encourage the rioting that was taking place last year, but not by even romanticizing it. And if anything, the police brutality would get reported, the rioters would get reported, but the violence of the rioters would not be properly reflected in the reporting. So at the end of the day, why are they surprised? I mean, no government in most countries would ever tolerate that kind of situation, that kind of chaos and breakdown in law and order happening on their own streets.
And Mr. Hong, this is the key there. Whether those offenders of this national security law are actually a threat to national security, and who's to decide what kind of offense this is? Because peaceful demonstrations, of course, are still allowed in Hong Kong. The problem is, who are those offenders, and are they dealt with according to the law?
Well, first of all, the final decision has to be decided by a court of law, okay, which is quite rightly spelled out in the law, in the legislation. I mean, right now, you and I, or any even law enforcement officers, are not at the final position to make a judgment on that. Mm-hmm. But if you read the new law carefully, it's actually quite detailed drafted, which is quite to my surprise, because normally laws like this will have like very high sounding things in like a principle kind of legislation. This one actually spells out quite detailed of what kind of activities and what kind, they're basically, these are like 4 kind of activities that will seriously threaten national security, secession, the collision with foreign forces, terrorism activity, these kind of things. So, yet, of course, just like you said, in a peaceful demonstration, if there is, for example, a slogan that says independence for Hong Kong, is that unlawful activity? I observed that yesterday there could be some protesters arrested because of that. Now, whether they will be prosecuted and whether there will be any court trial and final judgment on that, we'll still wait to see. Okay, but of course, if it's like evocation promoting independence of Hong Kong or separation of Hong Kong from the motherland, that is definitely illegal under the new law. Now, even in a peaceful demonstration, how do you distinguish people who are just protesting against, for example, a government's policy or activity, or in this particular case, advocacy for the separation of Hong Kong from the motherland? That, I think, will distinguish whether it's really a peaceful demonstration, well, peaceful otherwise, because in the law actually says very clearly that with or without the using of force, it is still illegal.
So the final verdict will still be made at a court? Yes,
definitely.
And Martin, another thing is that obviously the law has served as a deterrent for those who may not understand that their acts constituted a threat to national security, because obviously some protest leaders have resigned or even pulled away or tried to travel to other parts of the world to avoid their legal responsibilities. What do you think of their moves, Martin?
Well, I'm not. I don't know what their exact motivation is. Someone like Joshua Wong, I mean, they were resigning from.
It must have something to do with the new law.
Oh, of course. I mean, of course, it's an anticipation of it, and it's to take action beforehand. But I understand the law, in any case, is not going to be applied retrospectively. It only applies from when it's introduced.
Yeah.
So, but
Yes.
I would think that they are taking. I mean, what I read somewhere was one of them was saying, well, we don't want to prejudice the existence of our organisation, and maybe that's the case. Maybe they're trying to protect themselves in this situation. I just don't know exactly how they see their role will be in the ongoing situation. I mean, if there's continued demonstrations and if they violate the new regulations of the law, then at some point, particularly the leaders are likely to get arrested. And indeed, if you've got legislation like this, the point of it, in fact, is not. It would be to arrest the key offenders in that situation. That would be a logical approach conducted by the authorities. But we'll have to see. I mean, what you don't, really, the key to the effectiveness of the legislation is the extent to which really you don't need to arrest. Not many people demonstrate, and there are very, very few people that you need to arrest. And in that sense, it would be pretty effective and discourage what was happening last year, which was clearly very large numbers of people, even in the riots. Young people were getting involved in it for all sorts, no doubt, of different reasons. That's the situation you need to avoid now, because that's exactly what leads to serious law and order breaches, chaos, destruction, and so on.
But at least until now, not many arrests, no trials yet, but there are some responses from foreign government. For example, the government of your country, Boris Johnson, said the UK will extend residency rights and even a path to citizenship to 3 million people from Hong Kong who will have overseas national overseas status. What is Boris Johnson thinking when his country is trying to Brexit and living in the aftermath of COVID?
Yeah, well, I mean, he is given to gestures. When it comes to actual policy, he's not very smart. What do I mean, I think that Britain has this assumption that it has some kind of moral responsibility to Hong Kong and to the Hong Kong people. And one of the key pressures in the Conservative Party for making this case has come from Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, and he's been very praising of this legislation and so on. I mean, the British attitude, at least at a moral and rhetorical level, is somehow it thinks it's still, with China, responsible for what happens in Hong Kong. It's as if, the British attitude tends to be close to this. Well, there's two systems, and we're responsible for one system, and the Chinese are responsible for the other system. So it's never, in its mind, never been able to let go of
You won't even tolerate tens of hundreds of immigrants from Eastern Europe, and you want to accommodate 3 million immigrants from Hong Kong?
Yeah, well, it's not going to happen, is it? I mean, it's not going to happen, first of all, because I'm a long way from Hong Kong. But I can't believe that many people in Hong Kong will apply to go to the UK. I mean, why would they want to? I mean, in general, for large numbers of people, why would they want to go to a country which is basically in a mess? It's leaving the European Union. Its trading patterns future trading patterns are completely unclear. It's got no real trade strategy which stands any serious scrutiny. And living standards have more or less frozen ever since 2008. So why are people going to go in that situation? And furthermore, of course, a situation where we're going to have very, very large-scale unemployment after or in the light of COVID-19. So I just can't see why, unless why but a relatively small number of Hong Kong citizens would want to follow that. The other thing, of course, as you rightly point out, and that is, the British have become more and more averse to immigration. So are they really going to take kindly to a very large number of people coming from Hong Kong? I think not. I think it's a moral gesture. I don't think it's much more than that, to be honest.
And Mr. Hong, about the level of defiance of those protesters, of course, people expect those die-hard activists were still probably going onto the streets and doing things that they think appropriate. But according to the national security law, there must be some new levels of jail terms and law enforcement performances from police officers. Will they serve as enough deterrent?
I think so. I think definitely, because the most serious crime can be up to life sentence.
Because that's not the case for the anti-mask law we saw just a month ago. People still refuse to wear masks.
Very different. Yeah. Very different. First of all, the anti-mask law was actually a temporary emergency law anyway. It's not a proper law. Secondly, it was just one law, where this one, the new national security law, it actually has not just the law, but also the institutional design. There will be a new department under the police department that will be the enforcement of this national security related activities. There will be a special division under the Department of Justice for the prosecution of such offenders. There are various. There's a commission chaired by the chief executive at the whole SAR level to deal with security. So there are many institutional design, and this will ensure the law will be enforced, and also I think that will also bring enough prevention measures.
And also, last year, the courts in Hong Kong released quite some of the protesters, despite their violations of law, because there's no law that the judges can rely on to give a verdict. But do you think with the new law, things will happen, and people will serve the justice under this new law because they violated national security?
Well, first of all, I think I wouldn't, comment on past, judgment made by judges. But I think it's just not fair to generalize and say, oh, they have released. I mean, there were certain people released on bail on the one side. On the other side, there were people sentencing to different kind of sentences. Some of them may not be a sentence in jail, but more like community services and other kind of, punishment, because they're too young, and also because the actual criminal activity was, according to the judges, not very serious. Now,
so there wouldn't be an obvious increase of incarceration because of this new national security law, or we can only estimate? I think it should be on one side, because there is a new, actually the law it actually says, the new law actually says that anybody who have breached the national security law cannot be released on bail unless there is a agreement by the Secretary for Justice that there is no threat of this person being of a further threat to national security. So it's not as easy as in the past. Well, anybody can any low-level magistrate or judges can say decide to put the person on bail for $200. So there is such a bar. Okay, we have John Ross from Renmin University on the line. About the reactions from elsewhere, the United States has said that it would hand Hong Kong status as autonomous special region, and also politicians in the U.S. introducing what they call Hong Kong Safe Harbor Act to provide refugee status and asylum seeker status to Hong Kong protesters. What do you think the U.S. is aiming at, and what should Hong Kong and the Chinese government do?
Well, this is just a pretext. I mean, this type of legislation and initiatives by the US are not connected specifically to the events in Hong Kong. It's carrying out all sorts of activities against Huawei in the South China Sea, etc. So it's using this as a pretext. I mean, it's rather farcical because when the British ruled Hong Kong for 150 years and never had any form of elections, whatever, the United States never made any protest about this at all. So this is a pure pretext on what China's government should do, more or less what I think it's doing at the present time, which is acting in a calm and reasonable way, making quite clear the difference between very serious threats to national security or calls for secession and the normal right to secede. So far, in my opinion, it's handling the situation rather well.
But in the eyes of many Western critics, this law is anti-protest security law, anti-peace, anti-democracy law, anti-freedom of speech law, because it restricted Hong Kong people's expression of views, either on the streets or in the press. What do you say to them, John?
Well, this is purely nonsense. I mean, there are only a few offences. Terrorism, which is illegal in any country at all. Secession, for example. But I always say to people to the United States to understand that the greatest president in the history of the United States generally is regarded as Abraham Lincoln. And what was he famous for? He crushed the secessionists. They were called the Confederacy, but they were actually secessionists, right? And he's regarded as the greatest in the president of the United States. So nobody else is affected by this law. If you want to protest that you're paying too much in rent, or you think that there should be this or that change in the law, you're not affected at all by this. So this is just a great deal of nonsense that's going on.
And also, China and Hong Kong is waiting for messages from around the world about this new law. At the 44th session of the UN Human Rights Council, 52 countries welcomed the adoption, but there are also some others who oppose this. So it is a competition of voices in the international arena, John.
Yeah, but it's not an equal one. Kishore Mahbubani, who's a Singapore diplomat, very skilled expert on US-China relations, I put it very well. He said there probably are 20% of the countries who are mainly close allies of the United States who may wish to join in condemnations of China, and 80% of the world won't. It's the same over the situation in Xinjiang. A great deal of nonsense and great deal of noise is made in Western countries who are not Muslim, incidentally, and not one Islamic country has opposed China's policies in Xinjiang. So this is a number of people who are not, who have got their own specific positions, which are obviously often not connected to what they're actually saying, who are trying to interfere with China, but it represents a quite small minority of the world's population.
All right. Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Mr. Holm, for your insights and analysis. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Goodbye.